Hello, micro philosophical community. I'm often asked to talk in more detail about important contemporary philosophers, and I don't do enough of that. I don't share lectures here largely for health reasons, the very same reasons that have obstructed my philosophical careers. I've been seriously ill for 21 years. But let's begin, a drop at a time fixing this and have just a very casual chat today about Bernard Williams's relationship with Nietzsche and a criticism that he has received about his relationship with Nietzsche since his death, which is completely unbelievable, 22 years ago, which feels like about 7 years ago. Toward the end of his life, Brian McGee, whose philosophy interviews and conversations are the best philosophical content on YouTube, so go ahead and watch them. Not all of them are good. I'll give you a guide at some point about them. Some of them are bad, some of them are good. And I can also tell you which ones Brian thought were good and bad. But Brian told me that by the 80s and by the 90s, in his experience of his friendship with Bernard, that Bernard had come to identify with Nietzsche, that Bernard was in his 50s and his 60s and had really come to identify with Nietzsche. And I know that Brian meant that as 70% just an observation about Bernard's philosophical concerns and his stylistic evolution as a philosopher, but 30% meant it as a criticism. So what's the criticism? The criticism is that Bernard swam around too much in philosophical concerns and didn't come up with enough original philosophical propositional claims. So it's a kind of remark which implied that Bernard's extraordinary talent hadn't been fully realized by the reactive and negative way in which he did philosophy. And that's not my view, indeed, I don't agree with that view, but that's what Brian was saying with 30% of that remark. And of course, more recently, there have been claims in the philosophical community that Bernard's relationship with Nietzsche is somehow bogus. That Bernard stands in a kind of relationship to Nietzsche that Trump supporters stand in relationship to Trump. That's to say, as soon as you ask them what is it exactly that you like about Trump, they don't have a clear answer. So that criticism of Bernard's relationship with Nietzsche isn't, oh, he shouldn't have had that relationship. It's rather, he thought he had a deep relationship with Nietzsche, but actually he didn't. He was just drawn to a kind of image of Nietzsche, but that magnetic pull was undermined once you looked under the bonnet and realized how much divergence between Bernard and Nietzsche there was at the level of propositional claims and at the level of what they thought of philosophy in the world. Now, Brian Leiter is one of the people whose books I very much recommend, who makes that claim. And let's take a quick look at a version of that claim in action.
Bernard Williams' debt to Nietzsche is superficial, although not illusory. Yet it marks such a dramatic departure from the creditor's main ideas and claims as to make the suggested affinity more misleading than illuminating.
I wondered whether you had any sympathy with the idea that what Williams takes from Nietzsche above all is the critical program within morality. Quite take the point that he's not sort of, as it were, going in for any totalizing smashing or anything, but rather he is at his most Nietzschean when he's calling out bluff, when he's seeing through the positing of objectivity that isn't really there, seeing through the positing of external reasons which are really internal. Is that not Nietzsche?
That arguably reflects, again, that he read Nietzsche, and this was partly why he was more sympathetic to Nietzsche, say, than someone like Derek Parfit. And it's precisely because he didn't object to, being highly skeptical about morality's pretensions in various ways. So that's fair enough. I agree with that. Again, I think you're going to find on a lot of the details and, as it were, the extremity of it, that there are some that there are striking differences. And you see that again with, Williams's whole emphasis on, maintaining an idea of the voluntary and responsibility and so on, which Nietzsche doesn't.
So what's going on there? Well, there's a very wonderful philosopher, Miranda Fricker, who takes for granted Bernard's link with Nietzsche, who is a student of Bernard's, who's written some very nice papers about Bernard, and who has inherited quite a few habits. I mean, even in Miranda's writing that has nothing to do with Bernard, she has a few Bernard habits, including in the 2007 book, Epistemic Injustice, a wonderful book about prejudice that I highly recommend. And that has had an impact outside the philosophical community. It's actually had an impact in the disability community, for instance, globally, that I'm part of. And so she's asking Brian Leiter, come on, surely there is stuff here. And Brian's response is, on the best possible reconstruction of some of Bernard's most important views and the best possible reconstruction of some of Nietzsche's most important views, there isn't as much overlap as we'd think, and there is more difference than we'd think. Now, what do I think of that? I think that's silly. So that means that you begin to think about what the problem there is sociologically first, not philosophically. Because if you ended up in a place where you think that the excellent philosopher Brian Leiter is more Nietzschean than Bernard Williams, then something has gone very, very, very wrong. And so let's figure out what that is. Bernard had been drawn by Nietzsche for a long time, and in a way he was kind of pregnant with Nietzsche in a way he couldn't fully realize, because he felt there were some stylistic obstacles that the philosophical community, especially in the English-speaking world, needed to overcome to integrate Nietzsche. And Bernard did some of that for himself. He felt others did very important work there too, like Alexander Nehamas with his book Life as Literature in the mid-80s. But it's clear that Bernard wasn't drawn to Nietzsche because he shared 17 propositional claims, which he and Nietzsche both made, and which he recognized and went like that. It's also clear that Bernard wasn't drawn to Nietzsche the man. It wasn't the case that Bernard wanted to have 77 dinners with Nietzsche. And here we have to postpone a very important conversation for another time about the relation of writing and biography, which is different depending on what you talk about. I mean, it's different in the arts than it is in philosophy. It's different in within the arts, actually, between novelists and musicians and painters. But one thing you'd often find across the board, nevertheless, is a very interesting gap between the art production and the biography, and to a degree philosophical production and the biography. You know, if you met Beethoven, as the wonderful conductor Ivan Fischer likes to say, if you met Beethoven in person, this man who is the greatest master of transcendent, disembodied tenderness in the history of Western musical language, would scare you, you know, would freak you out with his erratic behavior. You know, you would sit there and Beethoven would go, "Ah!" And you would say, well, that guy's unpredictable. You know, this guy's crazy. He rips the wallpaper of the room he's renting. He's crazy. I don't want to have anything to do with him. So Bernard wasn't in love with the idea of having permanent dinners with Nietzsche, nor was he just counting up views. What, in fact, was going on there was that Bernard shared Nietzsche's concerns, and I'm, I think, a little bit stealing this way of talking about the connection of philosophers with one another, especially intergenerationally, from Avishai Margalit. who likes to emphasize that what we often focus on when we talk about philosophers we really admire aren't their views, and that we share their views, but that we share their concerns, whatever we think of their views, right? And in Bernard's language, that would be something like the way one going on in a certain way, if you know Bernard's work, is an expression that's very, very him, and brings a smile into your face. So what Bernard shared with Nietzsche are concerns, and therefore, even if Brian Light is entirely right about pointing out some views about, psychology or theory of action or whatever that Bernard couldn't have shared with Nietzsche, doesn't settle the question, right? Because the concerns overlap extraordinarily. And, of course, being Nietzsche and being Bernard also means you don't draw a sharp line between propositional views and concerns, right? Because propositional views come wrapped on the page, right, in a certain kind of stylistic rhetoric that is an expression of an underlying psychological reality, and so you can't separate them sharply. Can't separate views and concerns sharply. But certainly there is a deep preoccupation, that's to say, imaginatively coming back and back and back and back and back and back again to the notion that the moral can't be separated from the non-moral when we talk about human values and human motivation, and that the moral does not have priority over the moral. A deep commitment to a kind of naturalistic anti-scientism, right? We accept a scientific worldview, but we don't accept scientific reductionism, or we keep coming back to what that means in every case. A deep worry and a commitment to truthfulness, and the worry being that double-fold worry that in principle truth and other values can clash, and that in practice the modern world, for historical reasons which we need to give an account, and that too is an enormous overlap of concern, right? The way philosophy has to give way to history in both of their minds. But you've got a special problem that the modern world has with the conflict between truthfulness and other values, and that in our case the spectacular degree of reflectiveness and the conditions of modernity chases away certain social ways of going on that are a necessary precondition for making life feel satisfactory. Humor. How you balance heaviness and lightness. Above all, authenticity. Miranda Fricker, who asked Brian Leiter the question in that clip, feels that above all, Bernard's central preoccupation was the kind of individual freedom. That's an okay direction in which to go, but I don't think it's where I recommend landing. Where I recommend landing is in a version of authenticity. Going on in a way that is distinctively you is something that we find, relitigated in abundance in Nietzsche's thought. And it's something that was always very, very alive as a question for Bernard, not just about his own life, but about his own life as a philosopher. How do I make one's work distinctively one's own? And, with the very last completed book in his life, not completed in quite the way he would have liked if he'd had more time, Truth and Truthfulness, you get a certain kind of late style, early stage, late style self-realization, and that of Bernard, and that sort of stuff was very, very important for Bernard. So there we go. How do you sort of put it all together? Well, what you say is that not Nietzsche's biography, not Nietzsche's propositional views, many of which Bernard shared and others he didn't, and of course Nietzsche himself is hard to pull together across his life if we assemble everything that's been either published or left. But basically, for Bernard, Nietzsche's philosophical concerns and the way they sit in Nietzsche are an ego ideal. They're an ego ideal for Bernard as a philosopher. Always for fun, a psychobiographical remark to finish. I am enormously empathetic, obviously, to Bernard's relationship with Nietzsche, and my relationship with Nietzsche is difficult to talk about because I haven't brought out the philosophical work I intend to bring out for serious health reasons. But basically, my relationship to Nietzsche isn't that different to Bernard's, but it's different in some ways. Possibly, my relationship with Bernard is more like Bernard's relationship with Nietzsche than my relationship with Nietzsche. And that's because I think authenticity and truthfulness are at the core of Bernard's relationship with Nietzsche as philosophical concerns. And they are core for me too, but I take two additional inflections there in the relationship, the dynamic with Nietzsche. One is just around illness, and that's to do with questions of capacity for philosophical production under conditions of being very, very physically ill. And I have to be honest, that does leak out a little bit in my connection with Nietzsche, beyond just boom, 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 the moments where his health concerns arise in his own right. But then more importantly, I think that for me, I put as much front and center as authenticity and truthfulness, weight and lightness in my relationship with Nietzsche. I really see Nietzsche as someone I love, maybe even above all, whose work I love maybe even above all, for his capacity to transition from a lightness to a weightiness that nevertheless is a weightiness that inherits the naivety of the lightness but combines it with the distilled experience, right, of weight, making that weight not heavy. As Alfred Brendel, the great musician, would say, it's a lightness that's gone through heaviness and come back out on the other side. Bernard gets this completely, right? In his introduction to the Gay Science, he points very clearly to how that book ends, which is perhaps Nietzsche's greatest condensed manifestation of how you go from lightness to heaviness and back to lightness again. Something that I think in the 80s was complemented by an essay by Italo Calvino on lightness. So that's a little bit of a personal inflection there. We're going to do more of this. Lots of love.